The stagecoach that rolled into Harlan's Crossing on a dry Tuesday morning in the spring of 1878 carried only one passenger, and that passenger was about to turn the entire town inside out like a shirt that had been worn too long on the wrong side. Harlan's Crossing sat in the red dust of southeastern New Mexico territory, a place that had grown up fast and crooked, the way weeds grow when no one tends a garden. It had started as a water stop on the old Butterfield route, then swelled into something more complicated when silver was found in the hills to the east. Now it had a main street with two saloons, a land office, a general store, a hotel that charged too much for rooms that smelled like boot leather, and a sheriff who had been placed in his office not by honest votes, but by the generous hand of a man named Harlan Voss, who owned nearly everything in town and lied about the rest. Cornelius Archer was standing on the porch of his saddle and leather shop when the stage came in, as he did most mornings, because he liked to watch the world move even when he was standing still. He was 31 years old, broad across the shoulders from years of working leather, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of the sky just before a storm rolls in from the west, that particular blue-gray that is not quite one thing and not quite another. He had come to Harlan's Crossing 6 years ago from Texas, following work and leaving behind a few things he never talked about, and he had stayed because staying felt easier than deciding where else to go. He watched the stage driver haul back on the reins, watched the dust settle in golden clouds around the wheels, and then watched the door swing open. Minnie Collins stepped down from that stage like she had stepped down from 100 stages before it, with a straight back and a carpet bag in one hand and a leather satchel in the other, and she looked up at the town of Harlan's Crossing with clear brown eyes that took in everything at once. She was 24 years old, of medium height, with dark hair pinned up under a practical straw hat, and a face that was pretty in the way that honest things are pretty, not decorated or arranged, just entirely itself. Her dress was a plain brown cotton that had seen some travel, and her boots were sensible, and she looked, Cornelius thought from his porch across the street, like a woman who knew exactly where she was going even if she had never been there before. The stage driver tossed down a single trunk and a roll of canvas that turned out later to be a drafting table cover, and he said something to Minnie that Cornelius could not hear from his distance, and Minnie said something back, and the driver laughed in the uncomfortable way that men laugh when a woman has said something true that they did not expect. Cornelius went back inside and got back to work on the bridle he was stitching, because a woman getting off a stage was not his business, and he was a man who tried to stay in his own business as much as possible. That had been his policy in Harlan's Crossing for 6 years. Mind the leather, keep the accounts honest, and do not ask questions about the things that did not add up, because in Harlan's Crossing, very little added up if you looked at it directly. He had been there an hour more, working the awl through a stiff piece of harness leather, when the door to his shop opened and the bell above it rang, and he looked up, and it was her. Minnie Collins stood in the doorway of his shop with her carpet bag and her satchel and that straight back, and she looked around at his shelves of leather goods, the bridles and stirrups and belts and saddles, and then she looked at him and said, "You are Cornelius Archer." "I am," he said. "My name is Minnie Collins. I have been hired by the territory to survey the water rights claims along the Rio Seco tributary. I need a horse and a saddle. I was told you were the man to speak to about both." Cornelius set down his awl. He had not expected this. Women did not often come to his shop alone asking for horses. Women who came to his shop were usually with their husbands, asking for a new bridle or a repaired cinch strap, and they usually looked at his floor while they talked. This woman was looking straight at him. "Who told you that?" he said. "The man at the land office," she said. "A Mr. Prout. Though I should mention that Mr. Prout also told me that the water rights in this valley were all settled and clear, and I happen to know from the territorial records I read in Santa Fe that they are not. So I am taking his horse recommendation at face value and his legal opinion with some skepticism." Cornelius stared at her for a moment. Then, because he could not help it, he almost smiled. "Sit down," he said. "I have a horse you can hire. Tell me what kind of work you are doing." She sat in the chair across from his work table, which no one ever sat in because Cornelius never invited anyone to sit, and she set her satchel on her knees and she told him. She was a surveyor and a land recorder, trained in Santa Fe under one of the territorial commissioners, and she had been sent to Harlan's Crossing specifically because there had been disputes filed with the territory regarding water rights along the tributary that fed the valley. 3 families had lost their farms in the past 2 years, their claims invalidated by paperwork that had passed through the Harlan's Crossing land office, and someone in Santa Fe had finally decided to look into it. As she spoke, Cornelius felt something happen in his chest that was uncomfortable and unfamiliar, like a door that had been closed for a long time being pushed gently from the outside. It was not only that she was pretty, though she was. It was that she was telling him things that he had suspected for years and never said aloud, and she was saying them plainly, without drama, without looking over her shoulder, as if truth were simply the natural way to speak. "You know whose land you are walking into," he said. "Harlan Voss," she said without hesitation. "Yes, I have read the filed claims. His name appears on 11 separate water right transfers in the past 3 years, all of them signed off by the same notary, a man named Greer, and all of them originating from this land office." "Greer is dead," Cornelius said. "I know," she said. "He died 8 months ago. The territorial record lists it as a riding accident." "It was," Cornelius said carefully. Minnie looked at him with those clear brown eyes. "Was it?" she said. The silence between them was the kind that meant both of them understood something without saying it. "How long are you planning to be in town?" he said. "As long as it takes," she said. "I have a letter from the territorial commissioner. I have legal authority to access the land office records and to survey any claimed land. I intend to do exactly that." Cornelius looked at her for a long moment. He thought about the 6 years he had spent in Harlan's Crossing, keeping his head down, minding his leather, watching the town bend itself around Harlan Voss the way a river bends around a stubborn stone, not because the stone is right, but because it is immovable and the water goes where it can. "I have a good horse," he said. "Bay mare, 15 hands, sure-footed in the arroyos. I can have her ready for you tomorrow morning." "Thank you," Minnie said. She opened her satchel and produced a small wallet. "What is your rate?" "We can settle that after," he said, and he was not entirely sure why he said it, only that it felt right, the way some stitches feel right before you have pulled them tight. She put the wallet away and stood up and she said, "I appreciate your help, Mr. Archer." "Cornelius," he said. She paused at the door and looked back at him. "Cornelius," she said, and for reasons he could not have explained to anyone, the sound of his own name felt different in her mouth than it had ever felt before. That evening, Cornelius sat on his porch after the shop was closed and thought about Minnie Collins, and then he thought about Harlan Voss, and then he thought about the fact that a woman had just ridden into this town with legal authority and a mouth full of truth, and a plan to take apart everything that Voss had built with his forgeries and his convenient accidents, and he thought that he ought to feel afraid for her. And he did, but beneath the fear there was something else. Something that felt more like relief than anything he had felt in years, like watching the first clouds appear after a drought. He went to bed that night and did not sleep well, and in the morning he was up before the sun, brushing the bay mare until she shone. Harlan Voss heard about Minnie Collins before noon of her first full day in town. This was not surprising. Harlan Voss heard about everything that happened in Harlan's Crossing, partly because the town bore his name, and partly because he paid 3 separate men to tell him things, and one of those men worked at the hotel where Minnie had taken a room. By the time Minnie walked into the land office that morning with her satchel and her commissioner's letter, Voss was already sitting in his private office above the saloon, turning a glass of good whiskey in his thick hands and thinking. Voss was 53 years old, a large man who had once been strong and was now simply heavy, with a gray beard that he kept trimmed and eyes that were pale and watchful like a dog that has learned it is better to wait than to rush. He had come to this valley 14 years ago with nothing more than a claim stake and a talent for figuring out which rules could be bent and which people could be bought, and he had made himself into the closest thing to a king that the territory of New Mexico had in this corner of its geography. He did not love the land. He simply believed in owning it. He sent for his man, a fellow named Decker, who was not quite a deputy and not quite a hired gun but something in between, a man who ran errands that required both a badge and a willingness to forget what the badge stood for. "Find out everything about this Collins woman," Voss said. "Who sent her, what she knows, and how long she plans to stay." Decker nodded and left, and Voss turned back to his whiskey, and he was not worried, not yet, because women surveyors in territorial disputes were inconveniences, and he had dealt with inconveniences before. Minnie, meanwhile, was standing at the land office counter with her commissioner's letter laid flat on the surface, and a polite but immovable expression on her face, while the land office clerk, a thin, nervous young man named Toby Freeth, looked at the letter as if it were a rattlesnake that had somehow gotten into his desk. "I need access to the transfer records from the past 4 years," Minnie said. "Specifically, any water right claims that originated from this office and were transferred to Harlan Voss or any company bearing his name." "Those records are," Toby began and then stopped. "Are what?" Minnie said pleasantly. "They are," Toby said again, and he looked at the door and then at the letter and then at Minnie's face, which was patient and steady, and he said, "They are in the back room. I will get them." She spent the entire morning in the back room of the land office, sitting at a small table with a lamp burning despite the daylight because the room had only one small window, going through files with a careful, systematic hand. She made notes in a ledger she had brought with her, precise and dated and referenced, and by the time noon came she had found what she was looking for, not just irregularities but outright fabrications, claim transfers signed by men who, when she cross-referenced them with other territorial documents, had already been dead at the time of signing. She walked out of the land office into the noon sun and nearly walked into Cornelius Archer, who was crossing the street with what appeared to be a wrapped parcel. They both stopped. He looked at her and she looked at him. "Lunch," he said, holding up the parcel, and then appeared to be briefly surprised at himself, as if he had not entirely planned to say that. "I was about to look for the eating house," she said. "This is better than the eating house," he said. "The eating house puts lard in everything, including, I believe, the coffee." She almost smiled, and that almost smile did something to Cornelius's heart that was entirely inconvenient, and not something he had planned for on this Tuesday in the spring of 1878. They sat on the bench outside his shop in the warm New Mexico sun, and he unwrapped the parcel, which turned out to contain 2 portions of beans and cornbread from the Mexican woman, Senora Reyes, who ran a food stall 2 streets back and whose cooking was, in Cornelius's honest opinion, the single best thing about Harlan's Crossing. "You found what you were looking for," he said. "Enough to begin," she said. She ate the beans with the practical efficiency of someone who had eaten many working lunches, and then she said, "Mr. Voss has been transferring water rights using forged signatures of deceased landowners. It is, to be plain about it, fraud. The territory has grounds to void at least 9 of the 11 transfers I have identified." Cornelius was quiet for a moment, looking at the street. A wagon was going by, loaded with lumber. 2 men were talking outside the saloon. A dog was sleeping in a patch of shade near the water trough. All of it looked perfectly ordinary and peaceful, and all of it, he knew, was built on the foundation that Minnie Collins had just described as fraud. "You are going to make enemies here," he said. "I already have," she said. "I was followed from the land office to the street, a man in a brown coat. He is still watching from the doorway of the hardware store." Cornelius did not turn his head but adjusted the angle of his gaze without appearing to, and yes, there was the brown coat, and beneath it was Decker's unpleasant face. "That is Decker," Cornelius said. "He works for Voss." "I assumed as much," Minnie said. She finished her cornbread and folded the wrapping paper neatly. "I am not frightened of being watched." "You should be a little frightened," Cornelius said, and he did not mean it as a challenge. He meant it as something he felt, a genuine alarm rising in him at the thought of what Voss might do to someone who threatened what he had built. Minnie turned and looked at him then, really looked at him, and there was something in her expression that was not hardness exactly, but was the next thing over from strength, a kind of settled certainty about who she was and what she was doing. "I am fully aware of the risks," she said. "I have read the file on the notary Greer's death, and I have read the file on the Caldwell family who lost their farm, and I know that their son was run off the property by men who were nominally deputized for the purpose. I know what Harlan Voss is and what he is capable of. I am here anyway." The silence after that was different from any silence Cornelius had sat in for a long time. It had weight to it and warmth and something that felt like the beginning of understanding. "The bay mare is ready when you need her," he said. "Thank you," she said. "I plan to ride out to the Seco tributary tomorrow if you can draw me a map of the terrain." "I can do better than that," he said, and then he surprised himself again. "I can ride out with you." She looked at him steadily. "You do not have to do that." "I know the terrain," he said. "And I know which sections of the arroyo are dry only on paper and which ones are genuinely dry. That might be useful to you." It was useful, and they both knew it, but they also both knew that that was only part of what was being said, and the rest of it neither of them was ready to say aloud yet, and so they let it stand as what it appeared to be, which was a practical offer from a man who knew the land to a woman who needed to survey it. "Then I will be at your shop at first light," she said. "I will have both horses ready," he said. She stood up, straightened her hat, and walked back toward the hotel with that straight-back stride, and Cornelius watched her go, and Decker watched her go from the hardware store doorway, and the dog in the shade of the water trough scratched itself and went back to sleep, indifferent to the fact that something was about to change in Harlan's crossing for the first time in years. The ride out to the Rio Seco the next morning was the kind of thing that Cornelius would remember for the rest of his life, with the particular clarity that moments have when you do not know yet that they are going to matter. The air was cool and the sky was enormous and pale blue, and the sage and creosote gave off that clean, sharp smell that the desert makes in the early morning. And Minnie rode the bay mare with the easy competence of someone who had been riding since childhood, her satchel over her shoulder and her eyes moving across the landscape with the same steady attention they gave to everything. They rode mostly in silence for the first mile, and it was a comfortable silence, which Cornelius noticed because silence with other people was not usually comfortable for him. He was a man who had learned to be quiet as a form of self-protection, and he was unaccustomed to quiet that felt like companionship rather than withdrawal. "Where did you grow up?" he asked finally, because the question had been forming since the day before. "Missouri," she said. "Jefferson City. My father was a county recorder. He taught me the work." "And your mother?" "She died when I was 12, Minnie said, without particular drama, the way people state facts that have been absorbed long enough to stop bleeding. "My father raised me after that. He believed women could do the same work as men if they were given the same training." She glanced at him sideways. He was considered a somewhat unusual man for believing this. "He sounds like a reasonable man," Cornelius said. "He was," she said. "He died 2 years ago, heart failure." She paused. "He died knowing that I had gotten my surveyor's certification, and that made him happy. So there is that." Cornelius thought about the things people carry with them when they travel, not in their bags but somewhere else, in the particular set of their shoulders or the way they speak of the past with care. "I am sorry," he said. "Thank you," she said, and it was simple and genuine, and they rode on. The Rio Seco tributary was not, in the dry years, much to look at. It came down from the eastern hills in a rocky channel that widened in spring and shrank to almost nothing in August. And along its banks there had once been 3 working farms: the Caldwell Place, the Torres family homestead, and the Mercer claim, all of which were now empty, the houses standing with their doors open and their windows dark, the fields gone back to scrub and dust. The water rights to these properties had all, according to the records Minnie had found, been transferred to Harlan Voss Real Estate and Mineral Holdings, and the transfers had all been signed by dead men. Minnie worked the tributary for 3 hours, making careful measurements with her surveying instruments, recording flow rates and channel widths, noting the points where water was being diverted by the wooden sluice gates that had been installed. She said, within the past 2 years, directing water away from the empty farms and toward the Voss silver processing operation on the hill. Cornelius watched her work with a feeling he could not entirely name. There was admiration in it, certainly, the clean pleasure of watching someone who is very good at something do that thing with total concentration and precision. But there was also something else, something that had to do with the way she moved through the world as if truth were simply the only available option, as if lying or evading or looking the other way were not even real choices, were simply things that did not exist in the country she inhabited. He had lived for 6 years in a town built on the opposite principle, and he had not realized until this moment exactly how tired it had made him. When she had finished her measurements and packed her instruments back into her satchel, she stood up straight and looked at the empty Caldwell house on the ridge above the dry creek bed, and something moved through her expression that was more than professional concern. "Did you know the Caldwells?" she said. "Somewhat," Cornelius said. "The father, Thomas, used to bring his saddle into my shop for repairs. He had a daughter, Ada, and a son, Frank. Good people. Thomas had farmed that land for 11 years before Voss decided he wanted it. What happened to them? They went to relatives in Albuquerque," Cornelius said. Thomas signed the transfer under what I believe was significant pressure. He had 2 children and very little means to fight a man who owned the sheriff. Minnie was quiet for a moment, looking at the empty house. Then she said, "The territorial commissioner has the authority to void fraudulent transfers and restore title. If I can document the fraud clearly enough, the Caldwells could come back to this land." Cornelius looked at the empty house and thought about Thomas Caldwell's lined, tired face the last time he had brought his saddle in, how he had not said much and had paid in full, and had not met Cornelius's eyes when he said goodbye, and how Cornelius had not asked him why, because not asking was how he had survived in Harlan's crossing. The guilt of that sat in him differently now, here in the open air beside this woman who asked everything and evaded nothing. "Then let us make sure you document it well enough," he said, and the word "us" came out of his mouth before he had decided to say it, and he did not take it back. She looked at him, and something passed between them that was quiet but significant, a kind of alignment, 2 compass needles settling on the same north. They rode back to town in the afternoon light, and the silence between them on the return trip was the kind that comes after something has been decided even if the decision has not been fully spoken. Harlan Voss sent for Minnie Collins the morning of her 3rd day in town. The summons came in the form of a note delivered to the hotel by a boy who smelled like the saloon, informing Miss Collins that Mr. Voss would be pleased to receive her at her convenience at his office above the Silver Star Saloon. The note was polite in the way that certain kinds of threats are polite, dressed in courtesy, the way a blade is dressed in leather. Minnie showed the note to Cornelius over the morning coffee she had begun taking at Senora Reyes's stall, which had become, without either of them officially declaring it, something like a morning routine. "He wants to get measure of you," Cornelius said. "I know," she said. "I am going." "I know you are," he said. "I am coming with you." She looked at him over the rim of her coffee cup. "You are going to be very helpful to me in this town," she said. "I have been useless in this town for 6 years. He said bluntly, and something about saying it plainly to someone who would hear it plainly felt like setting down a thing he had been carrying without noticing the weight. She put her coffee cup down and looked at him with an expression that was both gentle and clear. "You have been surviving," she said. "That is not nothing." He looked at her for a moment and felt, absurdly, that he might have to look away, because being seen that directly by another person was something he had avoided for a considerable time, and it was more affecting than he had expected. They went to see Harlan Voss together. Voss received them in his office above the saloon, which was a large, well-furnished room that announced money the way some rooms do, not through beauty but through expensive accumulation, heavy furniture and a real glass window, and a good rug from somewhere Eastern. Voss stood when they entered, which was a deliberate courtesy, and he extended his hand to Minnie and then, with a fraction of a pause, to Cornelius, and his pale eyes moved between them with the calm assessment of a man who has been measuring people for profit his entire adult life. "Miss Collins," he said, "I understand you have been reviewing our land records." "That is correct," Minnie said. "I hope they are in order," Voss said pleasantly. "They are not," Minnie said. The room was very quiet. Outside, through the good glass window, Harlan's crossing went about its business, horses and dust and the distant clatter of the livery stable. Voss looked at her for a moment with those pale, flat eyes, and then he smiled, the kind of smile that is entirely surface and has nothing behind it. "I see," he said. "What concerns you?" 11 water rights transfers, 9 of which bear the signatures of individuals who were deceased at the time of signing, Minnie said. Also, irregularities in the original claim filings for the Caldwell, Torres, and Mercer properties. "I intend to document all of this in my report to the Territorial Commissioner." "You are very direct," Voss said. "I am," Minnie said. Voss's eyes moved to Cornelius. "I see you have made a friend, Mr. Archer." "I have been known to," Cornelius said. Voss looked back at Minnie. He was still smiling, but the smile had changed in some small way that was not an improvement. "The territory is a long way from here, Miss Collins. Reports travel slowly. Situations on the ground have a way of changing before paperwork catches up. I intend to have the report in Santa Fe within 2 weeks, Minnie said. I have already sent a preliminary letter documenting my presence here and my initial findings." That last part was the important part, and Voss heard it. Cornelius watched the smile disappear entirely, replaced by the original pale flatness, and he felt the small hairs on the back of his neck respond to it the way they responded to weather. "Well," Voss said, "I'm sure we can discuss any concerns about the paperwork in a civilized manner." "There is no discussion required," Minnie said. "I am not here to negotiate. I am here to document. Good morning, Mr. Voss." She walked out and Cornelius followed her, and he did not look back because he did not want to see Voss's face, not because he was afraid but because he did not want to think too hard about what it would look like. In the hallway outside, on the landing above the saloon floor, Minnie paused and let out one quiet, controlled breath, and then she straightened her already straight back and moved toward the stairs. "You all right?" Cornelius said. "Yes," she said. "He is very good at the kind of menace that does not use words." "He is," Cornelius agreed. "He has been doing it for 14 years. "Then he is due," she said, and went down the stairs. Cornelius stood on the landing for one moment more and felt something in him that he had not felt in a very long time, something that was the opposite of resignation, something forward-facing and lit up, and then he went down the stairs after her. What happened next happened over the course of 2 weeks that were the most alive 2 weeks Cornelius Archer had experienced in recent memory, and alive was the word for it, even though parts of it were difficult and some of it was frightening and all of it was uncertain. He was awake for it in a way that he had not been awake for ordinary days. He and Minnie fell into a rhythm that was both professional and something more, though neither of them said so directly, because they were both people who had learned to be careful with the things that mattered. Every morning they had coffee at Senora Reyes's stall, and they talked about the survey work and about the records and about Voss's various holdings, but also about other things, about Missouri and Texas and the territory, about books they had read, about what it meant to do honest work in a place that did not particularly reward honesty. He told her about Texas, more than he had told anyone since he arrived in New Mexico. He told her about his family's cattle operation, small and honest and always barely surviving, and about his father, who had been a decent man with no talent for the dishonesty that the cattle business in Texas in the 1870s seemed increasingly to require, and how they had lost the operation when Cornelius was 23, not to drought or disease, but to a man who bought up water rights along their stretch of river and squeezed them out. He told her that story and watched her face while he told it, and she listened the way she did everything, with her full attention and without interruption, and when he was done she said, "That is why you recognized what was happening here." "Yes," he said. "And why I did nothing about it." "You had nothing to fight with," she said. "I had my voice," he said. "I had my legs to walk into the sheriff's office. I told myself I had nothing, and that was easier than telling myself I was afraid." Minnie was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "And now?" He looked at her across the small table at Senora Reyes's stall, with the morning light coming in golden and warm and the smell of good coffee and chili in the air, and he said, "Now seems different." She looked at him steadily for a moment, and then she turned back to her coffee, and there was the beginning of a smile at the corner of her mouth that she appeared to be choosing not to fully deploy, and that near smile did as much to him as a full one would have. The work continued. Minnie documented the fraudulent transfers with meticulous care, building a record that was thorough enough to withstand any legal challenge. She interviewed the few remaining families who had lost land to Voss's scheme, taking their statements in a small notebook with dates and details, and she was patient and gentle with them in a way that made them speak more freely than they might have to a more official-feeling presence. There was old Diego Torres, whose family had worked their 20 acres for 2 generations, and who wept quietly while he described the day the sheriff's men came and told him his water rights had been sold. There was the widow Mercer, Clara, who was living in a single room above the general store, and who produced from a cigar box under her bed a set of documents she had kept, including a copy of her original claim filing that showed very clearly the discrepancy in the transfer records. Cornelius came with Minnie to these interviews, not because she needed him for protection exactly, but because his presence made the people of Harlan's Crossing feel that she had a known entity on her side, someone they had watched in his shop on Main Street for 6 years and found reliable if quiet, and that made them more willing to open their doors. Walking home from Clara Mercer's room above the general store one evening, in the blue dusk of a New Mexico spring evening that turned the whole street violet and gold, Minnie said, without preamble, "You are a good man, Cornelius Archer." He looked at her. The evening light was very kind to her face, though he had found over the past 2 weeks that all lights were kind to her face, that the quality of her features was more about expression than arrangement, the way her attention made everything it fell on feel more real. "You do not know me well enough to say that yet," he said. "I have been watching you for 2 weeks," she said. "I watch carefully. You are a good man who has been living as if he were not allowed to be one. I find that interesting." Cornelius was quiet for a moment, because she was right and because being right about him in that particular way felt more intimate than most physical contact he had experienced, and he did not know what to do with that except to be honest in return. "My policy in this town has been not to be a target," he said. "And I have watched things happen that a good man would have stopped, and I told myself it was not my place, and that was very convenient for me." "And now," she said. It was the same question she had asked before over coffee, and this time the answer was bigger. He stopped walking and turned to face her on the dim street, and he said, "And now I think my policy was wrong, and I think meeting you has made that as clear as anything has ever been clear to me." She looked at him in the violet dusk, and something crossed her face that was complicated and warm, something that had layers to it, and she said quietly, "That is a great deal to put on a woman you have known for 2 weeks." "It is," he said. I am aware of that. I am not asking you for anything. I am only being honest." She held his gaze for a moment and then she said, "I appreciate honesty, genuinely, in a way that is perhaps disproportionate given my profession." And then she did smile, full and real, and it was the first time he had seen her smile like that, unguarded and bright, and it rearranged something fundamental in the architecture of his heart. They walked the rest of the way in a silence that felt like the aftermath of something, like the quiet after a piece of music ends, and the room is still full of it. The trouble, when it came from the direction they had expected, which was Decker, and it came on the 11th day of Minnie's time in Harlan's Crossing, when she returned to the hotel from the land office to find that her room had been entered in her absence and searched. Her trunk had been opened and her personal belongings rifled, and more significantly, one of her survey notebooks, the one containing the measurements from the Rio Seco tributary, was missing. She came to the leather shop immediately, and when she came in her face was controlled but her hands, he noticed, were not entirely steady. "They took the tributary notebook," she said. "Cornelius set down the harness he was working on." "When?" "Sometime this afternoon. Between noon and 3, when I was at the land office. You reported it to Sheriff Briggs." She gave him a look that communicated very clearly what she thought of reporting anything to Sheriff Briggs. "Can you reconstruct the measurements?" "I have the instruments. I would need to go back out to the tributary, but the measurements themselves are not the foundation of the case. The land office records are. Those cannot be taken without more obvious crime. And I have the widow Mercer's original filing documents. Those are in my satchel, which I have not let out of my possession." She paused. "I believe the intention was not to destroy the case entirely but to frighten me." "Did it?" She looked at him and said very plainly, "Yes, I am frightened. That is not the same as stopping." Cornelius stood up from his workbench. He thought for a moment about the 6 years of kept head down, of minding his own business, of the comfortable cowardice he had named patience, and then exhausted the names for it in the face of this woman's refusal to use any of them. "You should not stay at the hotel," he said. "I know," she said. "I have a back room with a cot that is clean and has a good lock on the door," he said. "It is not comfortable, but it is more defensible than a hotel with a key that the owner clearly lends out." She looked at him and then around the shop and she said, "That would not be appropriate." "You are right," he said. "Senora Reyes has a daughter who is grown and has a room to spare. I know this because she has told me. She does not like Vas and she has lived here longer than anyone except old Diego Torres. I think she would be willing." Minnie relaxed infinitesimally. "Could you ask her?" He could, and he did. And Senora Reyes said yes with the firm enthusiasm of a woman who has been waiting for someone to do something about a situation for longer than was comfortable. And that evening Minnie moved her trunk and her satchel and her surveying instruments from the hotel to the small, clean room at the back of Senora Reyes's house. And Senora Reyes fed them both a supper of green chili stew and fresh tortillas, and looked between the two of them with the perceptive eyes of a woman who has seen many things and drawn accurate conclusions about most of them. After supper, sitting on the low wall of Senora Reyes's courtyard in the warm spring night, with the stars enormous overhead the way they are only in the desert, Cornelius and Minnie sat side by side in a silence that had, over the past 11 days, become the most natural silence he had ever experienced with another person. "I want to tell you something," Minnie said. "All right," he said. She was looking at the stars. "When I took this assignment, I was told by 2 different men at the territorial office that I should be careful, and by that they meant something different than careful be safe. They meant be careful not to cause trouble, be careful not to overreach. Be careful about what you put in the report." She paused. "I was told, not unkindly, that my position was provisional and that a report that created too much difficulty with a significant landholder might not serve my career well." Cornelius said nothing. He was listening. "And I thought about that," she said. "I thought about it for perhaps 15 minutes. And then I thought about Diego Torres and his 20 acres and his dead wife's garden. And I thought about Clara Mercer sleeping in a single room above the general store. And I thought about my father, who taught me that records are the way ordinary people protect themselves from the powerful, and that falsifying them is not a minor crime but a fundamental one, because it attacks the only ground that ordinary people can stand on. She paused again, and I stopped thinking about my career. The stars were very bright and very still. Somewhere in the distance a coyote called once and was answered by silence. "I am glad you are here," Cornelius said. She turned to look at him, and he turned to look at her, and they were close enough that he could see the starlight in her eyes, and the moment had the particular weight that certain moments have when they are on the edge of becoming something that cannot be undone, something that changes what comes after it. He said carefully, "I am also, for what it is worth, very aware that I am sitting next to a woman who is considerably braver than I have been, and more principled and more honest, and I find that rather than making me feel small, it makes me want to be better than I have been." Minnie looked at him for a long, quiet moment. Then she said, with great simplicity, "Cornelius, I like you very much." It was not a declaration. It was a beginning, and he understood it as exactly that, as something offered carefully by someone who had learned to be careful with valuable things, and he received it as such. "I like you very much also," he said. "I have from the moment you walked into my shop and told me that the land records were wrong." She laughed then, softly, and it was a wonderful sound, unguarded and real, and it floated up into the enormous New Mexico sky and dissolved among the stars, and Cornelius sat in the warm night feeling more fully present in his own life than he had in years. The following 3 days moved fast. Minnie went back out to the Rio Seco and took her tributary measurements again, and this time Cornelius rode with her and kept his eyes on the ridgeline, and they were not followed, or if they were, whoever was following them thought better of making themselves known. She documented the sluice gate diversions with careful notes, and she drafted the formal section of her report in the evenings at Senora Reyes's table, by lamplight, with the deliberate thoroughness of someone who knows the document they are creating will be contested, and has decided to make it uncontestable. Cornelius found himself helping in ways he had not planned to, going through his own memory of the past 6 years, and writing out, in his careful, unpracticed hand, a chronological account of what he had observed: the arrival of the sheriff's men at the Caldwell farm, the sudden departure of the Torres family, the conversation he had overheard in his shop between Voss and the late notary Greer. When Greer had come in to have a pair of saddlebags repaired, and Voss had come in behind him, and they had spoken quietly near the door, not quietly enough. He wrote it all down and gave it to Minnie, and she read it and looked up at him and said, "This is exactly the kind of witness account that supports the documentary record. Would you be willing to sign this and have it included as a statement in the report?" "Yes," he said, and then, because honesty seemed to be the operative mode between them, "I should have done this years ago." "You are doing it now," she said. "You make that sound like enough." "I make it sound like what it is," she said, "which is something. And something is the first part of enough." He looked at her across the lamplit table, at her dark eyes warm in the light and her pen still in her hand, and he thought that he was in a great deal of difficulty, the best possible kind, and that he was not remotely sorry about it. The completed report went to Santa Fe in the hands of the southbound stage on a Friday morning, 2 weeks and 1 day after Minnie had arrived. It was a comprehensive and thoroughly documented account of fraudulent land and water rights transfers, and it included Cornelius's signed witness statement, and the widow Mercer's original filing documents, and detailed survey data for the Rio Seco tributary, and the names of 9 deceased individuals whose signatures appeared on transfer documents they could not have signed. Harlan Voss was told about the departure of the stage by one of his 3 informants, and he was not pleased. He summoned Decker. He also summoned Sheriff Briggs, who came in with his hat in his hands and his eyes on the floor, a man who had traded his integrity for a salary long enough ago that he had largely forgotten he had once had it. "The report is sent," Voss said. "It cannot be unsent. What can be done is to discredit the woman who sent it." Briggs said nothing. Decker watched. "She is a woman alone in a territorial town," Voss said. "Without institutional support and without, as far as I can determine, any patron with real influence. Her position at the territorial office is, I have been told, provisional." He paused. "There are ways to make her testimony unreliable." Cornelius heard about this conversation secondhand, from Toby Freeth, the nervous land office clerk, who had been listening through the thin wall of the room adjacent to Voss's office while pretending to sort mailing. Toby was not a brave young man, but he had been watching Minnie Collins work for 2 weeks with the fascinated helplessness of someone who has seen honesty in operation for the first time and found it devastating, and he could not make himself stay silent about what he had heard. He came to the leather shop at closing time, twisting his hat, and told Cornelius what Voss had said. Cornelius thanked him and sent him home, and went to find Minnie. She received the information without visible alarm, but with the focused attention she brought to everything that required action. "He means to challenge my credentials or my character," she said. "Possibly both." "Yes. My credentials are solid. I have my certification from the Territorial Commissioner's office and my original letter of appointment. These are public documents." She thought for a moment. "My character is more vulnerable." "Your character is impeccable," Cornelius said, with more force than he had intended. She looked at him. "Thank you." But a woman traveling alone in a Western territory, staying in the home of a Mexican family, conducting business without a male supervisor, meeting regularly with a single man not her relation. These are all things that can be made to look improper by someone motivated to make them look so. Anyone who knows you for 5 minutes would know that is nonsense. "Cornelius," she said gently, "the people who will make the decision about my report are men in Santa Fe who have not met me." He understood what she was saying, and the injustice of it settled in him like a stone, cold and specific. He had grown up in a time and place where the rules were written for certain people and used against others, and he knew the shape of this particular injustice, the way a woman could do everything right and still be made to look wrong by someone with the motivation to do so. And he found that knowing this and being powerless about it were 2 different things, and he was determined not to be powerless. "Then we write letters," he said. "You write to the Territorial Commissioner directly. Toby Freeth has already demonstrated a willingness to support your account. Diego Torres, Clara Mercer. I will write to every person I know in this territory who has any standing, and I will tell them the truth about what you are doing here and how you are doing it." She looked at him, and he could see her thinking, measuring, and then something resolved in her face. "Will you go to Santa Fe with me?" she said. The question was quiet and practical, and also, underneath the practicality, something more personal, and he heard all of it. "Yes," he said, without hesitation. Her eyes were warm and steady on him, and she said, "I do not want you to put yourself at risk for my sake. I am doing it for every person in this valley who deserved better than they got," he said, and then, more quietly, "and yes, also for your sake. Both things are true, and I see no reason to pretend otherwise." The moment stretched between them like warm light. "Cornelius," she said. "Minnie," he said. And then, because neither of them was a person who wasted time when things were clear, she reached across the small distance between them and put her hand on his. And it was a simple gesture, but it was also the most significant thing that had happened to him in years. The gentle, deliberate weight of her hand on his, her fingers warm against his rough knuckles, and he turned his hand over and held hers. And they sat in Senora Reyes's lamplit kitchen while outside the spring night settled over Harlan's crossing. And for the first time in a very long time, Cornelius Archer felt that his life had found the shape it was supposed to have. They left for Santa Fe 5 days later. Before they left, 2 things happened. The first was that Voss made his move, exactly as predicted. A letter had gone to the territorial office, signed by Sheriff Briggs and 2 other Voss associates, asserting that Miss Collins had conducted her survey under the influence of personal relationships that compromised her objectivity, specifically naming her association with Cornelius Archer and her residence with Senora Reyes, and suggesting that her findings should be reviewed with appropriate skepticism. The second thing was that Toby Freeth, the land office clerk, had a crisis of conscience that was perhaps 6 years overdue, but was no less genuine for being late. He came to Cornelius the morning before they were to leave and produced, from inside his coat, a folded bundle of papers that he held in both hands with the expression of someone releasing a weight. "I have been keeping these," Toby said. "I know that makes me complicit. I kept them because I was afraid, and I am giving them to you because I am still afraid, but I am more afraid of what happens if I do not." The papers were copies, made by Toby in the course of his official duties, of the original fraudulent transfer documents, including the notarized versions bearing the impossible dead men's signatures, and also a letter, in Voss's own hand, to the late Greer, instructing him on which names to use and which dates to backdate. It was, in short, exactly the kind of direct evidence that turns a documentary case into an airtight one. Minnie took the papers and looked at Toby with an expression that was both grateful and serious. "You understand that you will need to testify to this," she said. "I know," he said. "It will not be comfortable." "I know," he said again. "I know where comfortable got everyone." He looked at the floor and then at Minnie and then at Cornelius. "Tell me what you need me to do." The journey to Santa Fe took 4 days by stage and was not comfortable in any physical respect, the roads being what territorial roads in 1878 were, which is to say more ambition than execution, full of ruts and long dry stretches that put dust into everything including your teeth. But Cornelius and Minnie sat side by side in the swaying stage, and talked for 4 days in the way that people talk when they are discovering each other without any of the ordinary interruptions of daily life, and it was the kind of conversation that goes deep quickly, because there is nothing else to do and nowhere else to be. They talked about everything, about the future of the territory and the arrival of the railroad, which was coming and would change everything. About the Apache communities being pushed further and further by settlement policies that Minnie had strong and precise opinions about, having seen the documentation in Santa Fe of agreements made and broken. About the nature of land, what it meant to own it and work it, and what it meant to have it taken. About smaller things, too. He liked to read, mostly history and the occasional novel when he could get them. She liked to read also, broadly and fast, and had opinions about everything she read that she expressed without apology. He had never learned to cook anything more complex than beans over a fire. She was a capable cook who had learned from necessity after her mother died, and considered cooking one of the more honest arts. He had a dog at home, a brown mixed breed named Patch, who was being looked after by the boy next door. She had always wanted a dog, but the nature of her work had seemed incompatible with one. She laughed at things with her full self and without calculation, and her laugh was one of the best sounds Cornelius had ever heard in his life. On the second night at the stage stop in Estancia, sitting on the porch of the way station in the cooling evening air, she said, "What will you do when this is over?" "Go back to the shop," he said. "In Harlan's Crossing." He considered the question. The shop was his, the building owned outright after 6 years of careful saving. His tools were good, and his reputation for quality work extended further than the town. He could practice his trade anywhere there were horses and people who used them, which in the territory of New Mexico in 1878 was everywhere. "Perhaps," he said, "or perhaps somewhere else. I have been thinking that I chose Harlan's Crossing because it asked very little of me rather than because it suited me." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the dark plain. "My work takes me where the territory sends me," she said. "After this assignment there will be another." Water rights disputes are unfortunately not in short supply in the Southwest. She paused. "Santa Fe is the office, but I spend more time in the field than I do in Santa Fe." He understood what she was not quite saying, and she understood that he understood it, and neither of them said more. But the conversation stayed with him through the night and the next 2 days on the road. Santa Fe in the spring of 1878 was already a city with pretensions, with its plaza and its governor's palace, and the new commercial buildings going up along the main streets, though it was still dusty and western enough to feel like the same world he had come from rather than a different one. The territorial offices were on the north side of the plaza, adobe buildings with wooden floors, and the smell of paper and lamp oil that said government in any territory. The commissioner, a man named Alvarez, received them promptly, which Cornelius attributed to Minnie's preliminary letter and to whatever professional reputation she had established in 2 years of territorial work. He was a thin man of middle age with sharp, evaluative eyes and the manner of someone who has learned to read documents and people with equal precision. He read the report. He read Toby Freeth's affidavit, which Minnie had taken down carefully and had Toby sign before they left. He read Cornelius's witness statement. He read Clara Mercer's original filing documents and the physical evidence of the timeline discrepancies, and he read the letter in Harlan Voss's own hand instructing a man to forge signatures on legal documents. He read all of it in silence while Cornelius and Minnie sat in chairs across from his desk, and then he set it down and looked at them. "This is thorough," he said. "Yes," Minnie said. "I received a letter last week from a Sheriff Briggs in Harlan's Crossing and 2 other parties suggesting that your work had been compromised." "I am aware of that letter," Minnie said. "I expect you will find, as you review the provenance, that both additional signatories are either employees or financial beneficiaries of Mr. Voss." Alvarez looked at her for a moment. "I have already found that," he said. He authorized a formal investigation of Harlan Voss and his land holdings. He ordered the immediate voiding of 9 fraudulent water rights transfers pending the investigation's completion. He wrote a letter, in Cornelius's presence, to the governor's office, recommending that the investigation be treated as a priority matter. And he said to Minnie, with the kind of formal precision that is a man's version of a compliment, that the report she had produced was among the most thorough and well-documented he had received in his tenure. After they left his office, they stood in the spring sunshine of Santa Fe's plaza, and Minnie turned her face up to the sun with her eyes closed for a moment, and then she opened them and looked at Cornelius and said, "That is the beginning of the end for Harlan Voss." "Yes," he said. "And the beginning of something better for the Torres family and the Caldwells and Clara Mercer." "Yes," he said again. She looked at him with the full warmth of everything she was, and he thought that he had never in his life been so grateful to have opened his shop door on a Tuesday morning in the spring. "Minnie," he said. "Yes." He had thought about how to say this for 4 days on a stagecoach and had not arrived at any version more elegant than the direct one. "I would like, very much, to know whether there is any possibility of a future between us. I am aware that my shop is in Harlan's Crossing, and your work takes you across the territory, and that neither of these things is simple. I am also aware that we have known each other for less than a month. I am saying this anyway because I have found, being around you, that I am much less interested in the cautious approach than I used to be." She was looking at him with those clear, warm brown eyes, and she said, "Cornelius Archer. I came to Harlan's Crossing to document a fraud, and I found a man who sat on his porch watching the world and decided when it mattered to do something about it." She paused, and there was that smile again, that full, unguarded one. "Yes, there is the possibility of a future. A considerable possibility." He reached out and took her hand, there in the Santa Fe Plaza in the spring sunshine of 1878, and she let him, and they stood there together looking at the mountains in the distance, which were blue and enormous and entirely indifferent to human happiness, the way mountains are, and entirely beautiful for it. The return to Harlan's Crossing was different from the departure in the way that all returns are different, weighted with the knowledge of what has been set in motion, and the particular satisfaction of having done a necessary thing. They arrived back on a Thursday afternoon in late May to find that the town already knew something had happened, because Voss's behavior in their absence had been strange, tight and pacing. 2 more letters sent and received, a meeting in the saloon that had involved raised voices behind closed doors. The people of Harlan's Crossing were not stupid. They were only in the position of people who have been told for a long time that the powerful cannot be checked, and when they began to see evidence to the contrary, they responded with a cautious, watching attention, like a population emerging from a long winter and not yet trusting the warmth. Senora Reyes welcomed Minnie back with an embrace and a good supper, and that evening the 3 of them sat in the courtyard and Cornelius told the news quietly and plainly, and Senora Reyes listened and then said, in her direct way, "Good. It should have been done years ago." "Yes," Cornelius said, and this time it was not a confession of failure but a statement of fact, because the past could not be changed but the present could, and the present was changing. Over the following weeks, the investigation moved through its processes with the grinding momentum of territorial bureaucracy. Investigators came from Santa Fe and went through the land office records under Minnie's guidance. Depositions were taken. Toby Freeth testified to what he knew, nervous and determined, and survived the experience with his conscience finally at peace. Diego Torres came back from where he had been staying with relatives in Mesilla and gave his account with the quiet dignity of a man reclaiming something that should never have been taken. Harlan Voss fought it the way men fight when they have been powerful so long they have forgotten what losing feels like, with lawyers and delays, and the application of considerable money to the hope that something could be made to go away. But Minnie Collins had documented the fraud too well and too publicly, and the evidence was not something that lawyers could explain or money could make disappear. Voss found himself, for the first time in 14 years, in the position of the smaller party. Sheriff Briggs resigned his position in June, preemptively, before the investigation could formally address his role, which was cowardly but also somewhat merciful to the town, which did not have to go through the additional difficulty of removing him by force. Decker left town on a Sunday morning without telling anyone he was going, which was the closest thing to an admission of guilt that men like Decker make. The fraudulent water rights transfers were formally voided by the territorial court in July. The Caldwell family came back from Albuquerque in August, Thomas Caldwell older and thinner and tired in the way of someone who has carried a wrong for too long, and he stood on the land that was his again and said nothing for a long time, and then he said to Minnie, "I don't know how to thank you." And she said, "You don't have to. You are home." Cornelius watched this from a little distance, the practical reunion of a man and his land, and felt the particular satisfaction that comes from being part of something that is unambiguously right. He had been thinking through all of this about what came next for himself, not in the anxious way he used to think about the future, treating it as a thing to be managed and endured, but in the open way, looking at it straight. The answer, when he arrived at it fully, was not complicated. He went a Minnie on an evening in late August, the sky still orange and pink in the west, the air beginning to carry the first hint of the cooler season that was coming. She was sitting on the low wall of Senora Reyes's courtyard, writing in her field notebook, and she looked up when he came through the gate with the easy attention she always gave to his arrival, as if his presence were something she was consistently glad to see, which he had come to rely upon in a way that was both new and essential. He sat beside her and she closed the notebook. He looked at the last of the orange sky and then at her. "I have been thinking about what I told you in Santa Fe," he said. "About maybe going somewhere else." "I remember," she said. "I have been thinking about it for 3 months," he said, "and I have decided that where I want to be is where you are." That is the honest truth of it. She was quiet for a moment, looking at him with those clear eyes. "My work will take me to other places," she said. "There are 3 more territorial surveying assignments after this one. water rights cases in the Pecos Valley and a homestead dispute near Taos, and a large mineral claim survey near the Colorado border. It is not a settled life. It is a moving one. A saddler and leather worker can practice his trade anywhere there are horses, he said. And there are horses everywhere in this territory. You would give up your shop. I would sell my shop, he said, for a fair price. I have already had an inquiry from a young man in town named Pina who has been working as a cobbler and wants to expand. He is honest and capable, and he would do right by it. Minnie looked at him with an expression that was careful and warm at once. I want to be sure you are doing this because it is what you want, she said. Not because of me. It is both, he said. I want to do meaningful work in meaningful places with a woman whose honesty I find the most remarkable quality I have ever encountered in a person. Both things are true. I am not going to separate them. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she said quietly, "Ask me then." He took her hand, which was familiar to him now, the particular warmth and solidity of it, and he said, "Minnie Collins, would you marry me and let me come with you?" She said yes with her whole face before she said it with words, and then she said it with words, and then she said it again, and he kissed her there in the courtyard of Senora Reyes's house in the late August evening, with the orange sky fading to purple above the desert. And it was a first kiss that had the quality of something that had been building for months and was finally and perfectly arrived, warm and certain and unhurried. And Senora Reyes, who had seen it coming since approximately day 3, saw it through the kitchen window and smiled to herself, and turned back to her cooking with the deep satisfaction of a woman who is very rarely wrong. They were married in October of 1878 in the small church at the edge of Harlan's Crossing, a ceremony conducted by the new pastor, who had come with the railroad survey team and decided to stay. The attendees were not many in number but were significant in character. Senora Reyes and her daughter, Diego Torres and his oldest son, Clara Mercer in a good dress she had not worn in 2 years, Toby Freeth, who had come because he felt the occasion represented something of a personal redemption for him also, and Thomas Caldwell, who was back on his farm and had brought apples from his restored orchard as a wedding gift, the first crop he had harvested from his own land in 3 years. Cornelius stood at the front of that small church and watched Minnie walk toward him, and thought that he had lived 31 years doing tolerably well and surviving adequately, and keeping mostly to himself, and that none of it compared to the particular quality of aliveness that had characterized the past 5 months, and that aliveness had a name, and her name was Minnie Collins, and now it would be Minnie Archer. She reached him and looked up at him with those clear, warm eyes, and he thought he had never been so grateful for a Tuesday morning stage arrival in his life. They said their vows in the plain, direct language of the 1878 Episcopal marriage rite, and they meant every word with the particular sincerity of people who have made a practice of meaning what they say. And when the pastor declared them married, Thomas Caldwell clapped first and Diego Torres followed, and Senora Reyes wept openly and without embarrassment, and Toby Freeth blew his nose loudly into his handkerchief. That evening, there was a supper at Senora Reyes's house, with more food than the table could comfortably hold, and stories and laughter and the particular warmth of people who have been through something difficult together and come out the other side. Old Diego Torres told a story about his father's arrival in the valley 30 years ago that took a long time to tell and was worth every minute. And Thomas Caldwell talked about his plans for the expanded orchard, and Clara Mercer had, in the weeks since the land case had concluded, found both steady employment at the general store and a degree of security she had not expected to feel again, and her face across the table had the color of someone who has been allowed to look forward again. Cornelius sat beside his wife, which was a word he was still getting accustomed to in the particular way that it applied to Minnie, and he thought about all of it, the shape of the life that was beginning tonight, the survey work and the road and the arroyos and the territorial records and the leather and the horses, and it felt true. the way things feel when they have been arrived at honestly rather than by accident. He sold the shop to young Pina in November, a fair transaction that left both of them satisfied, and he packed his tools and his good stock of leather into the back of the wagon he and Minnie had purchased together, a solid-built vehicle with good springs that would hold up to the territorial roads, and he put Patch the brown dog in the front and let the dog sit between him and Minnie on the bench. And they pulled out of Harlan's crossing on a cold, clear November morning, with the mountains blue on the horizon and the road ahead running straight into the big sky. Harlan Voss's case worked its way through the territorial courts through the winter and into the following spring. His lawyers were good, and his money was considerable, but the evidence was overwhelming. And by March of 1879, the court had formally stripped him of 9 of his fraudulently obtained properties and ordered restitution to the displaced families. The 10th and 11th transfers remained under legal dispute, but the practical power of Harlan Voss over the valley was already broken, as completely as a thing can be broken when the foundation it is built on is shown to be false. Cornelius heard about the verdicts from a letter that reached them in the Pecos Valley, where he was working from a leatherworking bench he had set up in the back of a livery stable, while Minnie conducted the first of the 3 subsequent surveys. He read the letter over breakfast and told Minnie, and she read it herself and sat quietly for a moment, and then she said, "Good," with the same clean, complete satisfaction that she had said everything else he had ever heard her say. The Pecos Valley survey was followed by Taos, and Taos by the Colorado border work, and through all of it Cornelius worked leather and horses, and maintained the business of the wagon and the road and the practical infrastructure of a traveling life. And he found that he had not known how much he needed to be in motion until he was in it, how much the physical geography of the territory, its arroyos and mesas, and the way the light fell differently in every valley, fed something in him that the enclosed quiet of the leather shop had been slowly starving. He also found new things about Minnie, which was one of the better activities available in a life. He found that she was afraid of high places with exposed edges, which she managed by simply not looking down and proceeding anyway, and that this was entirely characteristic of her. He found that she sang when she was doing repetitive work, quiet and slightly off-key and entirely unconscious about it. He found that she had no patience for deliberate cruelty and infinite patience for unintentional difficulty, and that she extended the same careful attention to people she did not agree with as to people she did. He told her things in return, in the honest exchange of 2 people discovering each other without walls. He told her that he had been engaged once, before Texas fell apart, to a woman named Helen who had been kind and pretty, and had left when the cattle operation failed, and that he had blamed her for a while before understanding that she had simply wanted a settled life, and he had not been able to provide one. He told her that he had spent 3 years after Texas wandering the territory feeling that he did not deserve more than tolerable, which was a story that she listened to with the same steady attention she gave everything, and then said, "You did deserve more. You simply needed to be somewhere that asked for it." In the spring of 1880, working out of a base in Santa Fe, where Minnie now had a proper office and a recognized position as one of the territory's senior surveyors, they found out that they were expecting their first child. Minnie told him on a Sunday morning in their rented house near the plaza, sitting at the kitchen table with the sun coming in the east window, and she told him plainly and directly the way she told him everything, and he sat with the information for a moment, and then he got up and came around the table and held her, and she put her arms around him, and they stayed like that in the morning light for a long time. Their son was born in November of 1880, a healthy, loud boy who arrived in the world with great enthusiasm and very little patience, qualities his parents found deeply familiar. They named him Thomas, after Thomas Caldwell, who received the news by letter and wrote back a response that was 3 paragraphs long and ended with an invitation to bring the child to see the orchard when he was old enough to walk among the trees. Thomas Archer was an active, curious, opinionated small person who grew with the particular intensity of children whose parents are present and engaged, and who seemed to have inherited his mother's eyes and his father's hands, large and already reaching for everything within range. 2 years later, a daughter, who they named Louisa after Senora Reyes, arrived with the same enthusiasm as her brother but somewhat less volume, and was from her first weeks a child who watched everything with enormous, assessing brown eyes that made Cornelius feel he was being measured and found acceptable. Senora Reyes, who had moved to Santa Fe the previous year to be closer to her daughter, and had been, in all practical senses, the children's grandmother from the day they arrived, received the news of Louisa's naming by crying, and then feeding everyone in the vicinity until they were forced to stop by physical limits. Minnie's work continued to matter. The territory of New Mexico in the 1880s was a place in the middle of becoming itself, caught between its Spanish and indigenous history and the relentless eastward push of American settlement. And the question of who owned what and on what basis was not an abstract legal matter, but the daily reality of many lives. She surveyed land and documented claims and built, over years of careful work, a record that protected the rights of small landholders and farming families against the same kind of slow, systematic disenfranchisement that had brought her to Harlan's Crossing in the first place. She was not always successful. The territory was not always fair, and its institutions were not always honest, and she understood this with the same clear-eyed practicality with which she understood everything else, without illusion, and without the particular despair that comes from expecting perfection and finding imperfection. She did the work that was available to do, and she did it as well as it could be done. And she came home at the end of days in the field to the house near the Santa Fe Plaza, and the smell of the supper that Cornelius had learned, over years of necessity, to cook with some competence, and the sound of her children and her dog, who was now 12 and gray around the muzzle, and still climbed onto the bench seat of the wagon as though his joints were entirely reliable. And she was, in the complete and literal sense, happy. Cornelius had built a small leather shop in the back of the house, a proper one with his good tools and his bench, and his reputation had followed him from Harlan's Crossing to Santa Fe in the way that reputations for honest work do, and he had more orders than he could fill, and the satisfaction of working at something he was genuinely good at in a place that was genuinely his. He also, over the years, had become something of an unofficial notary for the small farming communities around Santa Fe, people who could not easily make the trip to the territorial offices, people who needed documents witnessed and signed by someone they trusted, and he did this work for reasonable fees, and sometimes for no fee at all when reasonable fees were more than the situation could accommodate. He had not planned this. He had not planned most of the things that had made his life good. He had planned to keep his head down in a leatherworking shop in a compromised town and survive quietly, and then a woman had stepped off a Tuesday stage with clear eyes and a mouth full of truth, and everything he had planned had been quietly and completely replaced by something better. Thomas Caldwell sent apples every fall until the year he died, which was 1889, and after that his daughter Ada continued the tradition, because it had become a kind of connection between what had happened in the valley and what had grown from it, and both families understood it as such. The Torres family remained on their 20 acres along the Rio Seco and farmed it for another generation. Clara Mercer, the widow who had kept the documents in a cigar box under her bed and thereby made the case unassailable, eventually moved back to Missouri and wrote to Minnie once a year until the turn of the century, letters full of practical information and dry wit that Minnie read and answered at the kitchen table on Sunday mornings. In the winter of 1884, They went back to Harlan's crossing for the first time since leaving it. They went because Diego Torres had written to say that he was getting old and would like to see them, and because Senora Reyes had heard that her friend Maria, who still ran the food stall 2 streets back from the main street, had been ill and wanted to visit. They brought the children, Thomas now 4 and Luisa now 2, and they drove the wagon down from Santa Fe through the cold, clear winter air and arrived in the late afternoon. The town had changed. The absence of Harlan Voss's particular kind of power, the slow, grinding weight of a man who had positioned himself as both benefactor and judge, had not made Harlan's crossing immediately virtuous or prosperous, because the absence of a wrong is not the same as the presence of a right. But there was a new sheriff elected by actual votes, and the land office had new staff, and Toby Freeth, who was still there, had been promoted to acting land recorder, and was doing the work with the particular diligence of someone making something right that they had been part of making wrong. Toby met them on the main street and shook Cornelius's hand, and then shook Minnie's hand with both of his, and said, "You know, I still get up every morning and think about what would have happened if you had not come." "You would have found another way," Minnie said. "I would not have," Toby said. "I know myself well enough to know that. I needed you to arrive first." They visited Diego Torres on his 20 acres, and the old man sat in the winter sun and drank coffee and held Luisa on his knee and talked to Thomas about farming and the valley. And he was 80 years old and strong in the way that people are strong when they have kept their roots in the right ground. They visited Senora Reyes's friend Maria, who was recovering from her illness and was made very happy by the company and the children, and the food that Senora Reyes had brought in covered pots, and the kitchen of the little house was warm and full of voices and the smell of good cooking. Cornelius walked past his old leather shop in the afternoon and stood outside it for a moment. It was still a leather shop. Young Pina had the name on the sign now, Pena Saddlery and Leather, and the smell coming from the open door was the same smell of fresh-cut leather and neatsfoot oil that he had lived with for 6 years, and a boy was sitting on the porch where Cornelius used to sit watching the street. He stood there for a moment, not sad but attentive, measuring the distance between who he had been and who he was, and finding it considerable and finding the distance good. Minnie came and stood beside him, and she took his arm in the easy, familiar way that had become the natural grammar of being beside each other. "What are you thinking?" she said. "That I stayed here too long out of fear," he said, "and left here at the right time because of you, and that both things are exactly true and neither one cancels the other." She leaned her head against his shoulder briefly, a gesture so familiar it had become like breathing, and said, "That is a very honest thing to say." "I learned from the best," he said. She looked up at him with those eyes that had been looking at him clearly for 6 years now, and still made him feel seen in the specific, valuable way that only she had ever managed. "Take me home," she said. "Gladly," he said. They loaded the wagon with the Torres family's gift of dried chili, and the apples that Thomas Caldwell's daughter Ada had sent via the Torres family, and they bundled the children into the wagon bed with blankets against the winter air, and Patch the old dog climbed into his seat with laborious dignity, and they drove out of Harlan's crossing in the last of the afternoon light, heading north toward Santa Fe. Back to the house near the plaza and the leather shop in the back, and the work that was still ongoing and still mattered, and the children's voices floated back from the wagon bed, with the specific immortal quality of children being happy, and the road opened ahead of them under a sky that was turning from blue to the deep gold of a New Mexico evening. Cornelius held the reins in his hands that were his father's hands and his own hands, and let the horses find their pace, and beside him Minnie sat with her shoulder against his, looking at the road ahead with those clear eyes that had looked at everything they encountered and found the truth of it. And he thought that this was what a life looked like when it was being lived correctly. Not perfectly, not without difficulty or loss or the weight of things that could not be changed, but correctly. In the direction of honesty, and toward the people you had found who made honesty feel like coming home. The wagon rolled north, and the sky deepened to purple, and the first stars appeared above the mountains, and the children fell asleep in the wagon bed, and the old dog settled his gray muzzle on Minnie's knee, and she put her hand on the dog and her other hand in Cornelius's, and they drove through the New Mexico evening toward everything that was waiting for them, which was considerable and good and entirely theirs. 3 years after that, in the spring of 1887, their third child arrived, a boy they named James, after Minnie's father James Collins, who had taught her the work and believed she could do it, and whose belief had sent her onto stages and into land offices, and eventually into a leather shop in a crooked little town, where a man had been waiting on his porch for something to change. And Thomas Caldwell's daughter Ada, who had taken over the orchard and expanded it, drove the first cartload of spring apples to the market in Albuquerque that year, and used part of the profit to plant 20 new trees, and wrote to tell them so. And the letter sat on the kitchen table for a week, because both Cornelius and Minnie kept picking it up and reading it again, for the simple pleasure of a thing that had come full circle. Old Patch died that same spring peacefully in the sun in the courtyard, with his gray head on Minnie's foot, and Thomas, who was 7 and serious about important things, dug the grave himself and made a small wooden marker with his father's help, and they buried the dog under the apricot tree, and Louisa made a small wreath of desert flowers for the spot, and it was a grief that was also, in the particular way of grief for a good and long life, a kind of gratitude. They got a new dog, a black and white dog with one brown eye and one blue eye that Thomas found at the livery stable and insisted had specifically chosen them, which was almost certainly true. They named him Compass, which was Minnie's idea, and which Cornelius thought was about the best possible name for a dog that would grow up in a family built on finding true north. Minnie's position at the territorial office was formalized in 1888 as Senior Land Recorder for the Southwestern District, a title that had not existed before she arrived, but was created for her because the work she had built could not be adequately described by any title that already existed. She supervised 3 other surveyors and oversaw an expanded program of homestead documentation that was, in practical effect, the systematic creation of an honest record for a region that had never fully had one. She was 34 years old, and she was exactly where she had aimed to be, not in terms of position or title, but in terms of the work and what the work meant. And she did it with the same clear-eyed directness with which she had done everything since she stepped off a stage in Harlan's Crossing a decade before. Cornelius was 41, and he had finally, in the way that some people find their fullness only in the second half of their lives, become entirely himself. He made beautiful leather goods, and he witnessed documents for farmers, and he taught Thomas, who had his mother's aptitude for precision work, the use of the awl and the stitch, and he sat on the porch of the house near the Santa Fe Plaza in the evenings and watched the world move, as he always had, but differently now, not as a man keeping his head down, but as a man who had a place in what he was watching, a connection to it, a stake. He had acquired, over the years, a reputation in Santa Fe as an honest man, which is the simplest kind of reputation and also the most durable. And he wore it lightly because it had not cost him anything extraordinary, only the willingness to do what a woman who spoke nothing but truth had shown him was simply possible. Harlan Voss himself died in the spring of 1885, in Las Cruces, where he had retreated after the investigations of 1879 had stripped him of his significant holdings and his practical power. He died in modest circumstances, which was not a satisfying ending in the way that dramatic endings are satisfying, but was perhaps more appropriate, the slow reduction of a man whose power had always been made of other people's losses, and who, when those losses were returned to their rightful owners, had nothing underneath. Cornelius heard about it from a letter from Toby Freeth, who was by then the full land recorder for Harlan's Crossing, and he read it and thought about the man's 14 years of accumulated wrong and the 2 weeks of honest work that had begun to unravel it. And he thought about the weight and the lightness of things. And then he set the letter down and went back to the saddle he was stitching, because the living had more claim on his attention than the dead. The spring of 1890 brought the Santa Fe Trade Fair, a thing that had grown with the railroad from a regional market into something more complex and lively, and the entire Archer family attended on a Saturday, all 5 of them plus Compass the dog, and they walked through the stalls in the warm spring air, and Thomas ate too much candy and was not sorry about it, and Louisa, who was 10 and already had her mother's systematic way of looking at everything, produced from her pocket a small notebook in which she had written down the things she wanted to see and was checking them off, and little James, who was 3 and enthusiastic about everything, wanted to touch all the horses. They ran into Diego Torres' son Eduardo at the livestock pens, and Eduardo shook hands all around and admired the children, and reported that his father was still on his 20 acres and still growing chili, and that the water from the Rio Seco ran as it always had, clear and cool in the spring. They ran into Clara Mercer's cousin, passing through from Missouri, who said Clara was well and had bought a small house of her own and was considering a garden, and that she had mentioned the Collins case, as she called it, to everyone who would listen and several people who would not. They ate lunch from a stall that sold roasted corn and beans and tortillas, and Minnie said it was almost as good as Senora Reyes's cooking, and Senora Reyes, who was with them because she was always with them for significant occasions, said it was almost as good as hers, and they all laughed, and Compass stole a piece of Lewis's tortilla, and Thomas told on him, and the day was warm and full and ordinary in the specific way that full lives make ordinary days, which is to say it was not ordinary at all. It was everything. That evening they walked home through the Santa Fe streets in the blue dusk, and the children ran ahead with the dog, and Cornelius and Minnie walked together in the comfortable closeness that 12 years had made between them, deep and settled and still, even now, full of something alive and forward-leaning. She took his hand, as she had taken it the first time in the lamplight of Senora Reyes's kitchen in a town built on lies, and he held it, as he had held it then, with the full attention of someone who understood what was in his hand. "What are you thinking?" he asked her, using her own question. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the last light on the mountains. Then she said, "I am thinking that my father would have liked you." He was quiet for a moment, receiving this. "I hope so," he said. "I think I would have liked him." "He would have liked that you listen," she said. He said it was the rarest quality in a man, actual listening, and the most important, because you cannot tell the truth to someone who is not listening for it. Cornelius thought about the Tuesday morning on his porch when he had watched her get off the stage, and the bell above the shop door, and the clear directness of her eyes across the work table, and the way she had sat in the chair that no one ever sat in and told him the truth about a town he had been pretending was something other than what it was, and the way he had, for the first time in years, simply listened. "I listened," he said. "You did," she said. "You always did." The mountains held the last light like cupped hands, and the children's voices came back to them on the warm evening air, and the town of Santa Fe moved around them with its ordinary life, its horses and lanterns and the distant sound of the plaza, and Cornelius Archer walked through it all beside his wife, and the door that had been pushed open from the outside 12 years ago on a Tuesday morning in the spring was still open, and the light that came through it was as good as any light he had ever seen. And in Harlan's Crossing, now a town that had had several years to practice being something other than what Voss had made it, the land ran to the mountains in the east, and the Rio Seco ran down through the valley in the spring, and the Caldwell orchard had trees that Thomas Caldwell had planted 20 years ago, and new trees that Ada had planted in their place and in the spaces between, and the water flowed where it was supposed to flow, and the records at the land office said what was true. And that was the ending that Minnie Collins had ridden in to make, and it had held. It had held because one man had listened, and listening had been the beginning of everything.